Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arif Jetta, and I'm a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Dalla Lana School of Public Health. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which my institution operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this land is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to conduct our work on it. So I'm really excited to be moderating this session today, which focuses on the progress of research funded by Accessibility Standards Canada. So the first question you might be asking, what is Accessibility Standards Canada? I believe they're well represented at this conference. But just a brief overview, Accessibility Standards Canada creates and reviews standards that apply to the federal government, as well as federally regulated entities. These standards will identify, eliminate, and prevent barriers to accessibility. So aligning with the Accessible Canada Act, Accessibility Standards Canada focuses on 7 priority areas, which includes employment, the built environment, information and communication technologies, communication, procurement of goods, services and facilities, design and delivery of programs and services, as well as transportation. Notably, Accessibility Standards Canada funds research that can produce an evidence base that can be used to meet its objectives of a fully accessible Canada. So on the panel today are recipients of the Accessibility Standards Canada research grants. Each panelist will describe progress made on the respective projects, as well as key findings and next steps in their research. So in today's presentation, we have 3 panelists. The first is Dr. Mahadeo Sukai, Head of Research and Chief Accessibility Officer at CNIB. The second is Tara Connolly, who is Assistant Director of Research and Development at READ Initiative at Carleton University. And the third is Dr. Vera Roberts, Senior Manager of the Inclusive Design Research Center. And while I'm moderating the session, I am also a recipient of an Accessibility Standards Canada research grant. I will be presenting findings from my research funded by Accessibility Standards Canada in a session entitled Forecasting Strategies for Inclusion in the Future of Work, which will be held at 2:30 p.m. So I'd encourage you to add that to your session agenda. Before we start, in terms of the format of this session, we're going to have 3 presentations. And to test the technological skills that we've developed over the course of the pandemic, the sessions will be a hybrid of live and pre-recorded talks. The presentations will be followed by a short moderated Q&A, which I will lead. And then we will open questions to the audience. If at any point during the presentation you have questions or comments, please type that into the chat function, or feel free to save your questions towards the end and pose it during the Q&A. If you do type out a question, I'm going to read out the questions so that our terrific service providers can capture all your questions. You may also ask your questions verbally. Use the raise hand function so a member of the conference team can unmute you. Following the formal part of this session, there will be a networking session at 2:05 to 2:25 p.m., specifically designed as an opportunity for delegates to join the discussion and to share their ideas and thoughts. If conversations have started, you may want to continue that discussion in this networking session. So I'd now like to turn to our first speaker, Dr. Sukai, who will present some of the findings from his Accessibility Standards Canada research funding.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Mahadeo Sukai. I am the Director of Research and Chief Inclusion and Accessibility Officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind and adjunct faculty in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. I'm going to speak with you today about an Accessibility Standards Canada funded project that I hold as principal investigator through CNIB called Building an Evidence-Based Universal Design Framework for Employment Standards in Canada. The overall objective of this project was to undertake an evidence-based approach to the application of universal design and principles of inclusion within the workplace setting with a focus on sensory and visual processing disabilities. In addressing this project, we took as its scope an employment lifecycle approach. And so in building an evidence-based universal design framework for employment standards in Canada, we consider the following components of the workplace. Recruitment, inclusive of the job interview and navigating disclosure and accommodation, workplace social environment, inclusive of principles of an inclusive workplace, employer attitudes and employee attitudes, internships and transition to work, employer policies, for example, employment equity, disability, leaves and return to work policies, as well as equity, diversity and inclusion policies, inclusive leadership and management, and information and communication. This project is actually part of a network or an ecosystem of accessible employment research projects held by collaborators and funded by agencies at the provincial and federal level. And these projects include the Employment Transition Toolkit for Youth with Disabilities, held by Dr. Sally Lindsay at the Holland Bloorview Children's Hospital, a project on dual sensory loss and employment experiences in the Canadian Survey on Disability, held by Dr. Walter Wittick at the University of Montreal, Job Talks Access, a project looking at attitudes of employees with disabilities in the workplace, held by John Gallagher at George Brown College, an ASC-funded project on digital infrastructure, data, and AI in the workplace, held by Dr. Yuta Trevoranos at the IDRC, and the Mobility Access and Participation Project, held by Dr. Ben Mortensen at the University of British Columbia. In terms of project metrics, for 15 months of operation, the project has 12 academic collaborators, 4 nonprofit agency collaborators, 16 initiated trainee research projects, 10 of which are completed, 6 initiated research team-led projects, 3 of which are completed, 4 initiated external collaborative projects, 2 of which are completed, and 3 spin-off grants funded, 2 of which were funded through Accessibility Standards Canada. I'm going to, as an example of the work that we've conducted over the past 15 months, take you through a vignette of one project, the Levels of Employment's 2021 study, which was conducted to build the understanding of employment among persons with sight loss in Canada by examining the employment landscape, including levels of employment across demographic variables, specific aspects of current or most recent jobs, such as hours worked, disclosure and accommodation, barriers to employment and unemployment. This project was undertaken in particular to assess the impact of COVID-19 on employment experiences within the population in spring of 2021. To start with, we have an employment rate of 49% in blind or partially sighted working age Canadians as of June 2021. Now, this is comparable to the pre-employment rates of March of 2020, slightly lower than the last comprehensive assessment we did in December of 2019, but much higher than the employment rates that we were getting during the early days of the pandemic in April, May, and June of 2020, where the employment rate actually plunged to about 32% of this population. And so what we can actually tell is that the employment rate has rebounded after that precipitous drop. 31% of all respondents work full-time. That's 62% of all people who were working full-time. This number is lower than when we first profiled this population in 2018, when 67% of employed respondents were working full-time. 1 person in 8 who's employed works for themselves. And again, this is a lower number compared to the first time that we assessed this in 2018, when 16% of everyone who worked was self-employed. Younger people are more likely to be employed, but less likely to work full-time, while older people are less likely to be employed, more likely to be retired. And if they are working, they're more likely to work full-time. The takeaway from this is the employment rates in the working age population were significantly affected by COVID-19, but are rebounding, and the type of work is shifting away from full-time and entrepreneurship work toward part-time work, particularly in the younger cohort. As I said, we also profiled the impact of COVID-19 on employment experiences. We identified that 36% of those employed changed where they work because of COVID-19. 31% of those employed have had a change in employment status as a result of COVID-19, and that impact has been most strongly felt on people who are currently part-time or self-employed. Most commonly, people experience reduced hours, 35%, increased workload, 25%, changed jobs, 22%, and had their pay reduced, 15%. We also profiled the use of technology in the workplace as a result of COVID-19, and 58% of those employed have experienced changes in the way that their employer uses technology because of COVID. Among those who transitioned to working from home, 87% were able to bring home essential technology. 84% of those who transitioned to working from home indicated that their employer introduced new technology tools to facilitate working from home, and 47% made technology-related requests of their employer. We further identified that about 4 in 10 of those currently employed are experiencing accessibility barriers with technology tools needed to do their job. Another 4 in 10 experience some accessibility barriers with technology training in the workplace, and about a quarter, 1 in 4, of those currently employed are concerned that they would lose their job because of difficulty with work tasks. We also profiled barriers to employment within the survey, and we identified that, consistent with our previous findings, transportation, outdated attitudes about people with sight loss, technology, and workplace accessibility are the main barriers to employment. And these barriers are consistent across different elements of the employment life cycle. For example, finding a job, getting hired, and being promoted, but appear to decline in the promotion process. One of the spin-off Accessibility Standards Canada grants is actually held by us, and this is a project looking at accessible procurement in the federal public service and the federally regulated industries. Our objective here is to undertake a co-design approach with relevant stakeholders in the FPS and the private sector in the development of recommendations on accessible and inclusive procurement and supply chain models for the federal public service and federally regulated industries. This project was just funded and will run until 2024 and takes an approach of case studies, literature review and environmental scan of best practices, consultations on organizational attitudes and perspectives, expert stakeholder engagement, and modeling of existing accessible procurement approaches. One of the very positive side effects and benefits of the funding from Accessibility Standards Canada has also been its ability to assist us in developing an inclusive research ecosystem. And so I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that we have, throughout the project, fostered an inclusive research ecosystem. We have an inclusive research team. The core team, myself included, is 100% persons with disabilities. Our trainee complement has been 30% persons with disabilities. The work that we do is built upon inclusive research principles in governance, in data collection, data analysis, data interpretation, and data synthesis. And we train our trainees on this. And so we are building capacity for inclusive research in the next generation as well. Finally, I'd like to just acknowledge the members of the project team: Kathleen Bites, Yvonne Felix, Michaela Knott, Ainsley Latour, Natalie Martiniello, Ashley Shaw, and Michael Trolley are current members. Danica Blackstock and Matisse Hamel-Nellis are past members, as well as all of the current and previous project trainees and our organizational collaborators, as well as all of the academic researchers who've come to the table on this project with me and who have participated and been truly amazing people to work with throughout. As well as our nonprofit institutional partners as well, and of course our funder, Accessibility Standards Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sukai, for that wonderful presentation. It's great to see all the progress that you've made in your research. I'm now going to turn it over to Tara Connolly, who is the Assistant Director of Research and Development at the READ Initiative at Carleton University. So Tara, over to you.
Awesome. So I believe that we've probably busted the myth that tech is the happy place for all folks with disabilities. So I appreciate the opportunity for giving you a live demonstration of that. I'm going to start today's presentation just sort of also acknowledging something that we do at READ as well, is to acknowledge that the work that we get to do, which we're really excited to do. READ stands for the Research, Education, Accessibility and Design Initiative at Carleton University. And our work takes place on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. And so we do this at all of our presentations, and we note that, acknowledgement is a critical and important piece, but it's not the only piece. And it's really sort of through our own actions that we can really support that inclusive society. For any of those of you out there who would either enjoy and or benefit from a description, I'm a cisgendered woman. I am white. I have a blue swish of hair in the front, and I'm sporting my fancy new glasses today while I get to present to you. So this is exciting for me to be able to talk about. I've gone minimalist with my slides today because we've finished our project, and we are just in those last phases where we're talking to Accessibility Standards Canada. We'd like to present our findings to them, but I'm going to give you sort of a little bit of a sort of a sneak peek of it, I suppose. So our project, which was funded, and we're really happy about that, was Career Transitions and Accessibility in the Canadian Federal Public Service. So this was, I'll acknowledge our co-PI Principal Investigators Group, which was Boris Vukovic at Carleton, myself, Tara Connolly, Janet Mantler, Linda Schweitzer, and Lorraine Godden, all also from Carleton University. So that was our investigators team, and I'll ask Sarah to go ahead to the next slide. And we had quite an extensive research team as well. I also loved, READ is all about making sure that accessibility, and as we approach accessibility, that is also informed through the lived and living experience of folks who identify with disabilities. And it's informed sort of critically as well from the disability community. So that means from design to output, all of it. So certainly on our research team as well, that was inclusive of folks with lived experience of navigating barriers out there as well. So this is our fairly extensive research team, and it was led by Samantha Butler and Mervat Sanala, who did a fantastic job of working with all of our RAs. Thanks, Sarah. I'll let you get to the next slide. So letting you know what the project was actually about. So really it was meant to take a good look at the facilitators and the barriers that are existing in the really key transition points for folks in the federal public service. So we kind of did an expansive look at that and wanted to really explore not only what the barriers and facilitators were, but what the impacts of those were. And this was in part because we know the government has indeed started a journey on this itself. It has done some surveying and has a lot of good work already started. So we wanted to be able to support that and augment it to a certain degree, as well as inform the standards. And I know Arif, you'll be asking us about those types of things in terms of informing the standards a little later on. But essentially, you know, we wanted to be able to identify and examine those barriers and facilitators and get some new evidence that could inform the development of the standards, as well as really providing some recommendations that could give some targeted actions to the federal public service as well as it continues its own journey. So that was an important piece for us. Sarah, I'll get you to go to the next slide for me, please. Great. So in exploring these transitions, we wanted to look at the into, the within, and the as we leave the federal public service, because all of those have some very key important transition points, whether that's as you're hired and you're onboarded, whether you are accessing promotions or making lateral moves, your mobility throughout the organization, and even when you're separating, when you're going to exit. We also included the idea of people who might be thinking of exiting and ask them about either why they were thinking of doing so or why they have not and what the impacts of that are for them as well. I'll get you to go to the next slide, Sarah. I appreciate that Sarah is doing this piece for me. My computer has been a bit cranky with me today, and you know, we have a love-hate relationship right now, my computer and myself. So Sarah, if you can move to the next slide, that'd be awesome. Great. So we really wanted to connect with the experience of folks who are living through these transitions, right? One of my biases around transitions is when I speak about transitions, transitions are not solely the person who is making the transition. And I feel that a lot of times we speak about it that way, but really when we go through a transition, whether that's at work or in life, there are also people around us who are in the environment or also experiencing that transition with us to a degree. So we took a very holistic look at those transitions and the importance of them. So what we did to glean some information was we engaged in 78 interviews. We had a survey as well. So there were 410 respondents to the survey. We engaged in 6 focus groups, and 4 focus groups that included, that was specific to managers and human resource staff, that included folks with lived experience and other folks who might have identified as having the typical experience and not necessarily identifying. So it was a fairly extensive group we reached out to. Sarah, I'll get you to move to the next one. So I thought I'd give you a little insight around, for instance, what we spoke about in the focus groups. I'm not going to bring you through our full survey and all of the questions we asked in looking at all these facilitators and barriers to accessibility, but giving you a sense of what focus groups emerged from the initial information we brought in from the survey. So we had one that was about separating from the federal public service and looking at sort of long-term disability leave for folks who are impacted by that. The idea of trying to get into the federal public service from the outside and what the experiences were, what barriers people felt there were taking place, what potential facilitators, what made it easier for them. We looked at promotions within, and that was there were a lot of good discussions around that as well. We talked about hiring, promoting, and we also looked at supporting managers in hiring and career transitions, essentially as developing their own accessibility confidence, because we realize that certainly managers are a key role to be looking at when we talk about accessibility. They're kind of deal breakers in a lot of ways. And what we gleaned from our information, where we heard that the confidence and competencies and what a manager could bring to the environment as an inclusive leader had impacts absolutely for folks with disabilities. And not only the confidence in implementing accessible employment practices, but also in their approach to inclusive leadership. And interestingly, that could be either a great thing where someone would, when that was found, that was a fantastic thing for an employee, but also could mean that someone might not move on and be more mobile in the organization because of a fear that there's not other managers who would also have that same approach. So as you can see, there's a lot of nuances to many different pieces of the accessibility landscape. Sarah, I'll get you to move on to the next slide for me. So in terms of identifying barriers and facilitators, we really went through creating key themes of what those were from the perspectives of all of our respondents. And then we wanted to look at those interconnected issues that would help then increase manager confidence and tackling some of the unconscious bias, potentially attitudinal pieces, the cultural pieces, along with accessibility policies, practices that were there. So for instance, when you talk about accommodations, the accommodation process is one tool within the greater approach to accessibility. And sometimes there's an intensive focus, and while it is an absolutely critical tool, it's not the only one. And we wanted to sort of crack open that space around seeing accommodation and accessibility is exactly the same thing, and really helping within our recommendations people understand the impact of accessible practices on an environment. And so again, introducing people to the idea of universal design, right? So that while being able to request an accommodation and have it be timely and the process be there, and all of the pieces around disclosure that are incredibly important and complex, that there's additionally an understanding that the spaces and the places can be designed in such a way that sometimes accommodation might not be asked for. I'll get you to move on, Sarah. Great. So I'm going to give you a little, rather than digging deep into the report, we will have a report. Absolutely. It is completed and done. We're just in the middle of speaking with, connecting with Accessibility Standards Canada so that we can provide the information to their group as part of our way of informing continued development of the standards. But it will be available certainly through the READ website, and in ongoing other pieces we do is mobilizing this knowledge, because a lot of great insights and time and effort was provided by folks within the federal public service who are very engaged on how to sort of continue to create better ways to navigate the environment and for folks to thrive. But giving you some insight into some of the recommendations that we'll be making, we see these recommendations as opportunities for the federal public service to really start continuing to build capacity and competence and expertise around supporting these transitions, and really doing well with disability disclosure, because it is a complex piece, and it's not as simple as disclose and something will happen that is good. And because there was complexities to that, we wanted people to really be able to understand what disclosure is about and how we facilitate spaces and places for that. We also wanted to be able to present the opportunity for some innovative collaboration. The reason why we also focused on facilitators, not just barriers, where there's some fantastic ideas that come out of disability community, as we well know. Many of us are benefiting over this last few years from captioning, whether it's in meetings. And we know that we have to give a shout out to disability community who's been saying that for many, many years. And so we see some of the pieces that are now becoming more quote unquote normed. Those have come from innovations from a long time ago. So there have been some really interesting suggestions around mentorship and around possible positions and roles that could occur in the federal public service space that was generated through the participants in this study. So, but some of the, I will review for you here. We wanted to give recommendations around addressing unconscious bias. Not only in managers, by the way, we are not just focusing in on, but this is a really important group that has a lot of power to determine the setting in some ways, but that they also needed support. We heard that very strongly from the managers group, that the intention is there to do some great work, and yet still needing that support from other areas within the organization and other levels to be able to support all sorts of people to thrive within the setting. Implementation of accessibility policies and practices that are either there or that there are gaps in and there need to be some created would be an important action step. Addressing the inconsistency in the quality of those key transitions and their accessibility practices that are applied. So we did see that there was there were disparate experiences around how easy it was to move from one setting to another, depending on what practices were engaged in to make that accessible to an employee. Same thing with experiences around onboarding, being the hiring process, all of those pieces. Also streamlining some of the onerous policies and procedures, which they in themselves, although well-intentioned, are actually creating barriers that we noted. And supporting that those effective transitions by creating a transition resource. And that was one of the innovations suggested or explored by our team and the folks that we were chatting to throughout the process of this research. So those are the recommendations that come out, that are coming out of our work. We're excited about these next steps where we get to start to mobilize this knowledge a lot more. We're super appreciative of the funding that Accessibility Standards Canada has been putting out to many different organizations so that we're getting a true diversity of perspectives and approaches to these things. I love the intersection between, for instance, the use of tech, digital assistive technologies, how we're engaging in terms of creating these environments and what we're doing around policy and practice. So they all come together in a really very important, I'd say, quilt, if you will, of strategies, perspectives that we can start to overlay across what we've already started. Sorry, I'll get Sarah to go to the last screen. I just put, you can certainly ask for more information about this through the READ initiative of the website I've put there, sorry, the email, which is read.initiative@carleton.ca. And the principal investigator for this was Boris Vukovic, so I put his email down there too, which I'm sure he'll be thrilled about.
So I'm Vera Roberts, and I'm with the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University. The IDRC has three projects, but I want to tell you a little bit about the IDRC before I get going. And when I say three projects, I mean three ASC projects. So the IDRC has been operating since 1993 as a self-funded center at first at University of Toronto, and since then at OCAD University. And we're in an international community of open source developers, designers, researchers, and educators and co-designers who work together. And we do that to proactively ensure that emerging technology and practices are designed inclusively. And we have at any one time multiple projects underway. as well as our outreach and consulting services. And we connect and build on our projects so that they extend and continue and are adapted to new technologies and concepts. So in the last year, IDRC had 3 projects funded by Advancing Accessibility Standards Research Program of Accessibility Standards Canada. And these 3 projects were Future Work and Disability, which ran from March 2020 to March 2021. Future Work and Disability Equitable Digital Systems, which ran from October 2020 and is still running and will continue until March 2023. And then we have one that just started called Communication Access under the Accessible Canada Act, and it'll continue until March 2023. So I'm going to talk about the projects from newest to oldest. So newest is our Communication Access project. And this project focuses on communication access for people who have speech, language, and communication disabilities due to lifelong or acquired cognitive and or neurological disabilities. So we're talking about things like cerebral palsy, autism spectrum disorder, Down syndrome, learning disability, intellectual disability, fetal alcohol syndrome or spectrum disorder, traumatic brain injury, aphasia after a stroke, dementia, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, or multiple sclerosis. So these are the areas we're focusing on, and that is distinguishing from deaf or hard of hearing populations for other reasons. So the Communication Access Project has 2 main objectives. So first, we want to define the disability populations and personal communication supports for Canadians requiring access to federal goods and services. And then secondly, we want to define the scope of accessibility barriers and accommodations that people with communication disabilities may require to access different federal services. So we have 2 main deliverables that we will be producing. One is a Framing Communication Accessibility in the Canadian Context report. The other is a report called Scope of Accommodations and Supports for Communication Disabilities in Federally Regulated Context. So the first report, the Framing report, will extrapolate existing research in the areas of communication disability. It's going to better define the population and their diverse accessibility needs. And then it will provide recommendations for future research in the area. And this is because this is an area where communication access is actually not well understood in terms of the variety and scope of individuals who require it. And so that's one of the goals there. In the second report, we're particularly going to be looking at services that are available and scoping the supports that are available and what can be and where there's gaps in those services. And we'll undertake a number of interviews with stakeholders to identify these gaps and then work towards identifying possible approaches for better services. The second project, Equitable Digital Systems, or as we call it, EDS. This project recognizes that every job involves a digital systems, and up to now, there's been a lot of focus on customer or client-facing systems, but we feel we need to focus on the employee-facing systems, and in part, especially to address barriers like inaccessible interfaces and communication tools, the lack of interoperability with alternative access systems that we see with digital systems, procurement practices that fail to select accessible products. And I recognize that this is also addressed in Mahadio's project, but this is also, and this is how our projects often nest and intersect. So this is these are issues that we think need to be dealt with. We also want to promote integration of accessibility within digital products and interfaces, rather than expect assistive technology developers to interoperate, innovate, and survive as niche market products. So these are aspects that these are the sort of guiding rationale and thoughts for this project. We have many partners in EDS who are here today, even L'Arche Canada, Center for Independent Living Toronto, the IRIS Institute, CNIB Foundation, Wavefront Center for Communication Accessibility, READ Initiative of the Canadian Accessibility Network, and March of Dimes Canada, and Fable Tech Labs. So these are partners who are working with us, and in very important ways, because these partners are instrumental in helping to make sure that this is a community-driven project. The main outputs for EDS are a jurisdictional review of accessibility standards for digital systems and associated practices, and a catalog of categories or kinds of digital tools. Now, these two tasks have already been accomplished. They're ongoing, but they're ready, and we will be publishing those their data sets and reports for public access on our website. So we will be publishing those soon. We also are developing a case study that examines interoperability with AT of a typical federal employee system. So this is an upcoming work that's currently in planning. And then perhaps one of the most important parts of the project are recommendations and considerations reports for development of related standards. And this report is a community effort. We're working with community experts. EDS partners focus on community-led design and creation of the recommendation reports. So experts with lived experience of disability are come together. IDRC staff is there as a facilitator to help coalesce ideas. However, it's our community of experts who are working together to discuss surface barriers, discuss approaches, and move towards recommendations. And we want to understand system barriers in the context that employees experience them. And so that's those, and by context, I mean things like not just workplace, but in the context of pandemics, in the context of having family, other obligations, in the context of doing training, we use these things in all sorts of systems, and those systems tend to be overlapping and integrated. And so we're interested in exploring that. And the best way to do that is with people who, with real life people who are engaging with systems all the time. And so we are having co-designs where, as I said, IDRC facilitates, and our community experts come together in 3 sessions for each co-design. In the first session, we do what we call the what. We develop a shared understanding and uncover barriers. The second session is the try, or what we call the so what, now what. We've borrowed on an existing framework. It's not the what, so what, now what's. That's not our genius. But we're borrowing it because it helps us to frame what we need to do. We're exploring barriers and we're developing approaches. And so that happens in the second session with our communities, our community researchers and experts. And then in the last session, we move from that so what, now what that we explored, and we move towards this is what, our recommendations. And so we'll develop and document considerations or recommendations for standards development based on the exploration and learning from the previous 2 sessions. We just started, we had our first session yesterday, our first session 1 of our first co-design. It was really an excellent undertaking, went very well, and I'm really excited about this process. The last project I'll talk to you about is called Future Work and Disability. Sometimes we call it Forward or FWD as well. And in that project, which is now complete, we brought together a study group of 15 people, many with lived experience of disabilities, with researchers, artificial intelligence experts, data scientists, employment organizations, and others engaged in the data ecosystem. And we had 3 objectives. The first was exploring and understanding and drawing insights into how artificial intelligence and other smart technologies affect persons with disabilities and limit or improve their opportunities and well-being with regards to employment. We also wanted to produce a report that would share the insights gained through the workshop activities, and I'll explain the workshop activities in a moment. And finally, we'll want to use that to inform development of AI and machine learning standards. Now, I hinted earlier on, or I spoke of Accessibility Standards Canada really pivoting and helping us move towards a new format for our work. And this is the project that was impacted. It began in March, which coincided with the beginning of lockdown. And we ended up changing what we had originally envisioned as a sort of a 3-day intensive session of engagement and collaboration in person to a study group that happened over a period of 6 weeks, with 1 week of learning followed by a week of exploration, and then a week of learning and a week of exploration, and so on. And then finally, in the last 2 weeks of preparing the report, and then a couple of months of revisions and rewriting and collaborating after that. And so the result of that study group, which was community driven again, is published on our website. It's https://WeCount, WECOUNT inclusivedesign.views/FWD. And it's available there in English and French. And I encourage you to have a look at the report. Its findings are in the we sort of talk about each of the weeks, and then the findings are divided into some principles, 3 principles, and then we have recommendations for stakeholders. It's actually too much for me to review here, but I will talk about the 3 principles in particular. One is that you need to ensure transparency and disclosure in employment technology and processes. So in an environment where people with disabilities are expected to proactively ask for accommodations and advocate for themselves, we think it's also important that disclosure of the nature of technologies used in areas like hiring new employees or assessing existing ones, this is a bare minimum requirement. So in terms of principles for standards, this is one of our first principles. We also feel that the second principle should be promote the involvement of people with disabilities. And so far, I think that there's been a good effort to make sure that these research projects are inclusive and involve people with lived experience of disability. And this is important in any design. It helps guard against unchallenged assumptions about how everyone experiences the world. And this could lead, this has led to, or not having people involved can lead to undesirable outcomes like discriminatory technologies and costly retrofitting. And so, of course, involvement of people with disabilities is a key principle. And the third principle is protect human rights in society while supporting innovation. This was particularly important because future work in disability focused on AI technologies in particular, artificial intelligence and machine learning being technologies that sometimes have black boxes of what happens that aren't well understood, and also a tendency to amplify biases that already exist in society. And so any standards or policies need to protect human rights in society, but support innovation at the same time. And this in part reminds us of the notion of that we said earlier about transparency and disclosure being principle and prerequisite to allow for different stakeholders to have a voice. And legislative and regulatory steps should be taken towards achieving this goal to benefit all. We do have recommendations in the report, and they flow from those principles that I just talked about. And the recommendations are grouped for different stakeholders, employers and other institutional users of employment technologies, legislative and regulatory bodies, creators of technologies, and people with disabilities and their allies. And that's how we structure the key recommendations. You can learn more about these 3 projects that I think I sort of zoomed through, but I had a lot to talk about. And you can learn more about them at the Inclusive Design Research Center project site. That's idrc.ocadu.ca/projects-and-tools. So thank you to Advancing Accessibility Standards Program of Accessibility Standards Canada for your support of these 3 projects. And thank you for the opportunity to share our project with you. So I thank you to the organizers and the attendees here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. That was a really fascinating and comprehensive presentation. Okay, so we have all the panelists and their cameras that are on, so that's really great. And I know there are a few questions in the Q&A. We have 5 minutes in this formal session But just to note, the speakers will be sticking around for a networking session that will go from 2:05 to 2:25. So there's lots of opportunity to ask questions to all our panelists. So first, I'd like to congratulate everyone for really successful and innovative projects. And I think one question I'd like to ask the three of you is, how are you taking the evidence that you're generating from these innovative projects and integrating it or mobilizing it to modernize accessibility standards or revise existing or current accessibility standards? So maybe I can start with Tara because she was the last speaker, and then maybe go from Tara to Vera to Mahadeo.
Sure. Well, and so I was excited because I heard that through the other two presentations as well. It's certainly, we recognize that there have been journeys started around finding standards and practices and bringing in better practices, but that through partially that co-design and that inclusion of folks who are actually living the experience, that is of course crucial. And that is going to, I think, start to, when you talk about modernizing standards, having various perspectives of how standards are lived, right? Because sometimes we can apply something in a standard fashion, but it's not actually taking into account a real comprehensive view of the multiplicity of experiences. And so understanding that within our design, and I've heard that in all the three projects today. So that's one element. I think also not being afraid to point out gaps and barriers and not approaching things as if it needs to be good optics. It's not a bad thing to be questioning ourselves, our practices, our organizations. It's in fact a very powerful thing to be doing that. And so I think in the development of these standards, being brave, being not fearful of wanting that something will make us look as if we're not doing it right. And I would say that right down to the point of individuals as well too, right? Like it's okay that folks might not know something. It's about sort of the openness of starting to engage and understand and move forward. So awareness into action, as opposed to pretending that there's already an awareness or stopping at awareness.
Well said, Tara. How about yourself, Vera? How are you utilizing the evidence you're generating from your three unique but similar research projects into the modernization of accessibility standards?
Well, you know, we only have results from one, and of course, but we are thinking ahead about how our recommendations might be utilized by standards development committees with Accessibility Standards Canada, for example. And you know, one of my position, and I think the position of our projects, is that standards are important for spurring on change, especially where there might be resistance or an ignorance. And I mean ignorance in a kind way, as in just sort of not knowing differently or not knowing better, and even apathy comes into this. So standards can really help spur on change in those situations, but ideally, they're going to focus on human goals and needs and interactions with technology, rather than sort of strict technical specifications. And so what I think we're trying to bring in our projects is that interconnectedness and that human piece that we would like to see in the standards, because while the standards might be focusing on technologies, it's about how humans are impacted interacting with those technologies. And so that's I hope that's the change that we help to bring, because so often standards really are a very technical specification. And I think we can do that as a minimum, but go beyond that.
Yeah, well said. And especially when you're working on digital technologies, having the human element in the design of those digital technologies is critical. So I definitely see where you're coming from. I think that's a great point. How about you, Mahadeo? How are you utilizing the evidence you're generating into the modernization of accessibility standards?
So that's a great question, Arif. Thank you. And I'm going to speak out of both sides of my mouth here, because one of the things that I did not say when I introduced myself in the video is that I'm also chairing the Employment Technical Committee for Accessibility Standards Canada. So I, as a PI, I have this interesting role of generating evidence and having my team generate evidence that then in theory, my committee is actually going to take and use, right? And one of the benefits of these kinds of conversations would be for all of us who are engaged in Accessibility Standards Canada funded research to make sure that we're able to come together to identify what is the evidence that the technical committees need to read, right? So one way of mobilization and modernization is literally just that, making sure that the people who are actually going to write the standards have the evidence that they need in order to write the best standard that they can write. And you know, that's kind of an interesting bridge role that potentially I can play. And I say that also with my project manager and my vice chair sitting in the audience listening to this conversation, and I might get a text message from either one of them saying, no, you can't do that, but that's okay. I like them, they like me, and we get along. So there's that piece, which is kind of a mechanistic piece, right? But then standards are technical, but standards are a little bit different than an actual regulation, right? Because the regulation is the how, the standards is the what. And in the development of the standard, we actually have the opportunity to say, well, what are the things that we want to envision? What is the ideal state for, in the particular conversation we're having here, what's the ideal state for employment and accessibility and inclusion in employment and in the workplace in Canada? And how we get from here to there is where the standard is, where the regulation comes in. But what that ideal state is and why that ideal state matters is the province of the standard and the informative annexes that go with the standard. So then I think that once we accept that sort of premise, what we're doing is we're using the evidence to establish what that end state is going to be. And we're also going to be using the evidence to actually look at all of the different groups that work in concert with the standards. So how do the community service providers interact with this? How do the post-secondary institutions interact with this? It's an employment standard. It's for employers in the federal public service and the federally regulated industries, but the service providers and the educators feed into that space. So what's going to happen to programs and practices and policies and processes in those institutions that will actually help support the standard, and being able to think through that has been a critical exercise. One of the forthcoming parts to our project is let's actually try some things as real world experiments and see if they work. Because if we can't convince the employer of the business case, we can't convince the employer of the necessity, the standards are going to just sit there and molder and nobody's going to do anything with them. So the question is, ultimately, how do we make sure that that's actually going to work properly?
That's great. And I guess having you in this session, Nadia, wearing two different hats is great for all of us, because we can utilize your conduit into the development of accessibility standards as a way to translate evidence into practice. So it's great that you're involved on both sides of the story. So just to remind everyone in the audience, we're now in like the networking session that kind of aligns with these presentations. And so feel free to continue to pose questions in the Q&A, or we can add you as a panelist and you can ask the questions verbally. It's totally up to you. And I'm going to turn to a question that was actually posed in the Q&A chat. It seems like across a lot of the presentations, a kind of key theme was inclusive design and inclusive research. And so maybe based on some of the work that you have been doing within your Accessibility Standards Canada studies, could you maybe describe more about inclusive research principles and maybe some of the best practices, as well as maybe some of the challenges you've learned in this whole process of being more inclusive in both your research as well as the design or recommendations that you're generating? Maybe Mahadia, we can start with you.
Okay, thank you, Arif. So again, it's a great question. And in working with the READ initiative at Carleton and working with our friends at the IDRC, I know that Vera and Tara are going to have some interesting comments and really good reflections on this question as well. But I think when we talk about inclusive research, first of all, we have to appreciate that we're talking about all phases of research. We're talking about the recruitment of people to our teams. We're talking about the recruitment of people to our advisory committees and our governance of the research projects we're doing. But we're also talking about the consent form. We're talking about the survey, the focus group, the co-design session, the lit review, the environmental scan. We're talking about even going so far as to to say to ourselves, do we have any unconscious biases in the questions that we are asking, right? And can we call those out? Because if we don't call those out, then we will never know. If we don't ask a question, we will never know the answer. So naively, you know, if we take a pan disability approach and we say we're gonna look at all people with disabilities in Canada, and you poke at the Statistics Canada data that suggests the employment rate's 59% for people with disabilities in Canada, that's fantastic. But then when you actually unpack that, well, no, the 59% is not fantastic, but it's fantastic that we can get the number, right? But when you unpack that, then you realize that the employment rate for people who are blind or partially sighted is 53%. The employment rate for people with physical disabilities is whatever it is, mental health disabilities is whatever it is, and so on and so forth. So some groups are more nuanced than other groups. Some groups have a different employment rate than other groups. Some groups have a different age profile, a different ethnicity profile, a different gender profile, a different age of onset profile. So one of the neat things that we were able to do as part of the project is sort of dissect out the data for people with sight loss from the data for people with hearing loss in the Canadian Survey on Disability. The interesting thing is the hearing loss population is older. And so the baseline employment rate, not adjusting for age, is going to be concomitantly less than it would be for the sight loss population. And so because of age-related hearing loss, the issue is also that that you don't have so many people who are congenitally deaf or who lose their hearing early in life, and so those experiences are not getting reflected in the data. And so if we don't ask the question to unpack these things, then what ends up happening is we take kind of this you know, from geosynchronous orbit view of what's going on the planet, without actually, you know, kind of getting into the clouds and looking a little bit more closely, as it were. So it's also how we ask the question. And then it's also to the respect that comes from working with persons with disabilities in terms of honoraria and compensation. What do we do in terms of being able to provide them access to their stories and access to their narratives? They have control over how that information is shared, because that is their own IP, it's their lived experience, right? And so all of these things are part and parcel of the inclusive research conversation. I find what will sometimes happen is, you know, we'll have this sort of experience where I'll encounter a survey that somebody will do, and I'll give you another example. Researchers at Carleton and Ryerson did a beautiful study on impact of COVID on employee attitudes in the workplace and employee experiences, but they didn't ask the disability question. And so there was that problem. And then the survey itself, as much as I wanted to share it, wasn't accessible in its native form. And so when we talk about inclusive research, we have to also talk about the mechanism, the question, the people doing the work, the respect to the participants, the telling of the story, all of it.
Vera, I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that. I know this is your wheelhouse at IDRC. What are best practices for inclusive research?
Well, you know, Mahadio, when you remind to check assumptions, for sure, that's a hugely important thing to do when conducting any research. I like to work with my collaborators and ask my collaborators what their needs are. How do they want to engage? What do they think are important? And ideally, I'm not even the one asking those questions, but those things are able to percolate and surface because I'm taking a bit of a backseat to let the community of experts that I'm working with to feel free and able to talk about those things. But in some cases, you know, it has to be made explicit, or you explicitly find out what is the best way to communicate, or what is the best way for us to move forward on this? What tools do you like to use? And of course, ultimately in research with diverse individuals with diverse access needs, always think about the tools that you're planning to use, how you're going to use them. Are there other ways to adapt them and be flexible? You know, the classic we're going to use Post-it notes and stick them on the wall. You know, it can be effective in some cases, but has a whole bunch of accessibility barriers that, you know, from where you stick it on the wall to who can see those Post-it notes. So these are some of the pieces about the processes. It really is an end-to-end thinking, as Mahadio said, from the very start to the very end. But in that, I'm focusing on the engagement part, and I think there's lots of things to think about there and to work with your participants and your collaborators to understand.
Well said. And Tara, I'm not sure if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I believe actually after Mahadio, you know, like in the two speakers that could have already dropped the mic on this. So, you know, as well, actually love the way from start to finish that was conceptualized. But I think one thing also, I'll give an example in the survey that we developed. Not only was it informed first and foremost in the design, but then even after that, we had it reviewed and tested first before we even sent it out. Because of course, there's traditionally, you know, you can look for accessibility to screen readers and different pieces of that, but then even looking at sort of those invisible disabilities. So what is the readability? Are we using plain language? Are we really connecting? You know, how does the audience connect with that? All of those items are important, and you still can't assume you're getting it right. There isn't a we've got it right. So I think also that stance of openness, and I do realize that, you know, within research there's timelines and there are certain pieces that have to be put into play, but I guess having that openness to really explore how we can continue to tweak and continue on that accessibility is pretty important. The honoraria piece, really respecting and valuing the knowledges, valuing different types of knowledges, like when we look at, you know, Indigenous communities and how they might engage. And I'll give you, as someone who kind of has worked for many, many years with neurodivergent thinkers, even really explaining what could that look like? What does participating look like? So someone can anticipate if they're being asked to engage in co-design, what will that look like for them? We say that to employers all the time, right? You know, give a sense of what that if you want to recruit, give a sense of what a day in a life is in your workplace. Give many ways to access information about your workplace. Likewise, about the process. And I think also a stance, Mahadio mentioned in the idea of sort of continuing to support further research or researchers who identify with disabilities. Like that's an important piece too to incorporate in around how are we designing this process so that people are building their own skill sets, that they too can go back out into community and work within community as a researcher and a community researcher in a way that's meaningful to them, to their community, and not just as it's designated through the particular organization that's doing that research.
Thanks, Tara.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. And so kind of the beauty of this live session that's in a virtual environment is actually, we received a message from a project manager at Accessibility Standards Canada who has offered to answer some questions if anyone has them. And so I'm just going to introduce Quinn Redcope. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Quinn. But I guess, Quinn, I do have a question for you. And that question is, obviously in this session, you've heard some great research that's been funded by your organization. However, there's a huge ecosystem of researchers across Canada that are doing really innovative research. For those on this call, what are some of the best ways in which we can inform some of the standards that your organization is setting in terms of eliminating barriers to employment for persons with disabilities?
Well, that's a good question. And I think what you mean by inform is feed information in.
Yeah, exactly.
And so for that, it's very timely, actually, because as recently as yesterday, I have been a part of conversations where we're discussing this. Part of my role as project manager is to identify stakeholders, people in Canada that have that information to bring to the technical committee. By people coming to me and saying, hey, here's a little piece your committee might not have thought of. Is there a chance for us to present for 15, 20 minutes and have a question and answer? We've done that successfully already. Mahadio and our vice chair and I have made that happen for one really interesting piece of the accessibility within employment for people with disabilities. So I expect more of that to come. So by all means, get in touch with me. I'm again.
And so there is an opportunity for people throughout this conference, as well as externally, to reach out to yourself and other individuals within your department to share kind of key insights that they've collected. I just wanted to confirm that.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, so the way it happens is someone will usually get in touch with me. If it's someone from the federal government, usually it kind of goes laterally to the same position and then down, and then I present it to Mahadeo and Andy. And the last case, they brought it to the committee and they said, what do you think? There's someone here that would present. Do I have that right, Mahadeo?
That's right, Quinn.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened. I mean, in the context of research as well, you know, there is a large research ecosystem that's out there. RF, you identified it. And in my presentation, I actually rhymed off 5 or 6 collaborators who work in the space. And I didn't even mention Emil, who obviously is a big collaborator of my group, who is also a member of the technical committee. And so there's an ecosystem that's out there that what I've been quietly doing, less quietly now that Quinn knows about it, is to say, look, if you have something that you want to share, think about it. Remember that your job isn't to tell us what standards to write. Your job is to tell us what evidence you have to support the standards. And so go talk to Quinn or come talk to me and I will go talk to Quinn. And that offer stands for everybody.
Awesome. That's good to know. And I think Tara has a question. Tara.
Well, actually, just a little suggestion, I suppose. One thing we did is we included that piece into our transfer payment agreement, our contract to do the work. Essentially, we infused in that we would be reporting back to, not just as a report, but actually giving a presentation to Accessibility Standards Canada and their relevant groups and stakeholders. So we kind of infused it into our responsibilities. And that's why I didn't share some of the outcomes we had so far, because we're waiting to kind of do that process and piece for them. But I think that's also a good way to kind of help do that bridging as well, just an additional.
Awesome. Absolutely. Great. So we have just a minute left. And so I'm not sure if there's any final questions, but I did want to take this opportunity to thank everyone on this panel, Tara, Vera, and Mahadeo, for your terrific work in this area. I'd also like to thank Quinn for jumping in. That was fantastic to have someone from Accessibility Standards Canada join the conversation. And so again, we have a 5-minute break, and then the next set of presentations will begin right at 2:30. So we look forward to having everyone continue to participate in the conference, and thanks again to all our panelists.